Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek _ Deep Space Nine. A Stitch in Time. Andrew J. Book content text. What I am embarrassed about, I said too loudly, is my lack of control at our last luncheon. It was inexcusable. It's one of the reasons I stopped by today. I hadn't seen you since and I wanted to make sure you were alright, he said. That's very kind of you, Doctor. I'm fine. This took me by surprise. Perhaps this was not such a chance encounter after all. He was kind, perhaps the kindest person I've ever known. His courtesy, his consideration, indeed, his willingness to put himself at risk for people he didn't even know often astonished me. But I found his present concern about my welfare grating. I renewed my determination to rise above my irritation. You seemed quite upset when you left, he began, knowing full well how crotchety, as he put it, I could become at these ministrations of his. Have you been taking those pills? No. Well, yes, but I don't think they're doing much. After the incident when the doctor removed the cranial implant and saved my life, I had terrible headaches. They have lessened considerably, but during moments of stress my head can sometimes feel like it's coming apart. You should have told me, the doctor admonished in that parental tone he took with his disobedient patients. I'll reconfigure the formula and have some new pills for you tomorrow. That's very kind of you, Doctor, I repeated, attempting to control my growing impatience. What is it, Barack? What's going on? He asked with the disarming directness of his profession. Other than waiting for this invasion to take place, I'll be an old man when the Federation finally gets organized. Is it really necessary to get everyone's input? Romulans and Klingons need to be told what to do, not consulted or persuaded. The expression on Bashir's face told me that I was working myself up again. As you can see, my patience is being strained. Are you afraid of what you'll find there when the invasion happens? He asked. Perhaps of what I won't find there, I replied. He nodded. Silence returned as we sipped our cooling teas. Even if I had wanted, how could I even begin to explain to him? Court has a new, rather interesting holosuite program, he said, changing the subject. Or so I thought. Let me guess. It has to do with some epic battle pitting the beleaguered British against some Cardassian-type implacable foe. I needled. No, Bashir laughed. I'm afraid now's not the time for that. Reality has overwhelmed fantasy. No, the new program enables one to revisit his past. To pick a time, a pivotal incident. For what purpose? If I wasn't sure, my returning irritation alerted me to where this was going. I knew I had to be careful. With a minimum of programming time, place, key people, you can recreate the scene where you feel something happened that. Bashir paused, looking for the word. That was negative, injurious, a wrong choice, I prompted. Yes, he conceded. So you can change it, I added. Well, not actually, of course, but psychologically, physiologically. He also was treading very carefully. I took a deep breath. And you think this is something I should do? I asked bluntly. Honestly, yes, I do, he replied, relieved that it was finally said. I see. The tea was cold now, but I kept sipping. But you wouldn't need a program like that, would you, Doctor? Oh, I don't know. I have moments in my past. No, I interrupted. I mean that with your enhanced genetic capacity you are able to revise your personal history just by sitting in a room and rethinking those moments from your past. Bashir said nothing. With a faint smile, he looked down into the mug of tea he was holding between his hands, as if trying to keep it warm. A buoyant client came down the steps outside the door and was about to enter the shop, but for some reason he stopped at the threshold. He looked at us, turned, and went back the way he came. I am keeping you from your business. Bashir stood up. I won't take up any more of your time. Book content text. I'm pleased you stopped by. I was about to escort him to the door. No, you're not, he said quietly. Excuse me? Correct. I come from a culture that has perfected the stiff upper lip, he explained with the same faint smile. What does that mean? It was a genuine question. There was a change in his attitude. It means that we never complain, never admit to our feelings, never ask for help. It's just not done, Bashir explained. And those people who lack character and insist on airing their needs especially in public are subject to ridicule. And worse. Does this sound familiar? Perhaps. I replied softly. But I'm also a doctor, correct? And I know which group of people suffers the most. I really won't take up any more of your time. He extended his hand, which he rarely did, and I took it. Thank you for the tea. He turned and went out the door. I stood there for a long moment, deeply upset. I felt trapped within myself, knowing what I had to do to get out but unable even to begin. Yes, doctor, it does sound familiar. But as to the question of which group suffers the most. Book content text. 21 entry : At the end of 3 years, the review process was customary, to determine whether or not a student would progress to the next level, and if so, with what designation. It was a nerve-wracking time for all of us. If you didn't progress, you were sent back home in disgrace. And if you did, you were given your position in the group commensurate with your evaluated performance of the past 3 years. After Sharaban's betrayal, I became as withdrawn and solitary as I had been when I first came to the institute. I tried to spend time with Palandine, but it never quite worked out. Between her regular duties and the recruitment and planning for the female competition, she had little time for anything else. But there was something else, the distance that had crept between us that I didn't understand. I felt ashamed, that somehow I had failed and it was my fault, but I found it difficult to discuss. This was probably the loneliest I had ever been. On my way to the review hearing I felt conflicted. The lonely, betrayed part of me desperately wanted to go home and happily follow in Father's work. I hadn't seen my family in 3 years. And yet was it possible, after what I'd experienced here at Bamaran, the taste for success and recognition and, yes, power that I'd developed to spend the rest of my life cleaning up after parades and tending gardens? The childish fantasies had been replaced by real accomplishment and real friendship. No, I wanted to stay. And the moment that I came to this decision I realized that I wanted to achieve 2 goals, to beat Sharaban in the next competition and to win Palandine's love. The conflict dissolved, and I knew why I wanted to be here. All I had to worry about now was my designation. I was certain that I would progress, but to achieve these goals I needed a high place in my group. I began as number 10 because I came from the lower orders of society. To remain at 10 would mean that I had made little or no impression, which I didn't for a moment believe would happen. It was clear to everyone the family and social standing count at the beginning, but after that advancement was solely dependent upon performance. Even Sharaban's betrayal could be overcome. By the time I arrived at the prefecture I was ready for my hearing. I walked into the ante-room, where other students including my section mates waited in varying degrees of anxiety. One Lubac was pale. It was almost certain that he would be demoted. 9 wore a sneering smile and looked at me from his superior height. Ever since he was made second-level liaison he truly believed it was because of merit. He couldn't even deliver a message. I smiled back. 3 had been sent home. His disability made him unfit for further education. 2 fitted, preparing, I'm sure, a complicated presentation designed to tell the review panel exactly what he thought they'd want to hear. Why he never went to the political institute I'll never know. For was his relaxed self. He had nothing to fear. He would move through Bamaran from beginning to end on a straight line. He always knew how to take care of himself. 5 would no doubt move up. He was an asset in every area, and except for 8 the most decent one in the group. 6 had long since gone home. He wanted to succeed so badly, but his body couldn't withstand the constant assault of the training. I'm sure he found an academic situation. 7 was amazingly calm. Ever since the competition he was a new person. Even his ridges looked stronger. He was sure to advance. 8 was the only person who deserved number 1 as much as I did, maybe more. My solitary behavior was not always in service to the group. 8 and I exchanged encouraging looks. The support of my one constant friend was all I wanted. I sat there and shut out everything else. 10 Lubac. I jumped up and one Tartle, our section leader, ushered me into the lower prefect's office. Going in numerical order, I was the last one of my group to go in. I was surprised when Tartle didn't come inside with me. And when my eyes had adjusted to the darker rooms, I was even more surprised to see only 2 people, the first prefect and someone in civilian mufti. Book content text. Standing with his back turned toward me pouring a drink. Where were the student evaluators? The lower prefect? Why would the first prefect involve himself in a first-level evaluation? And who was? Hello, Elim. The stranger turned and it was an Agrantane ! 10 Lubeck. The prefect motioned me to the chair, but I couldn't move. The two men just looked at me. All my preparation for the evaluation flew out of my head, and I felt as exposed as I had my first time in the wilderness. 10 Lubeck. The prefect repeated. Yes, prefect, was all I could manage. What was Tane doing here? Sit down, he instructed. I obeyed. Tane passed an information chip to the prefect, who consulted it. During the ensuing silence I stole a glance to Tane, who was wearing his avuncular smile. What do I call him? I wondered. Certainly not Uncle Inagranda. What do you think you've learned here? The prefect finally asked. It wasn't so much his question as his attitude that threw me off balance. The question I had expected, his air of boredom, as if the day was one student too long, I had the ND.I. He wasn't even looking at me. Tane, however, continued to smile and wait patiently for my answer. Somehow his presence, disorienting as it was, encouraged me, and I found myself directing my answers to him. I learned that appearances deceive and that the purity of my thinking creates a sure path to the truth, I replied. So, Tane began, you believe all this to be a lie? He gestured to the room. It's deceptive. Why? He asked. Because our thinking is impure. I still didn't know how to address him. Is that all? The purity of one's thinking, he pursued. There are the hidden intentions of others. How are they hidden? By what they say they are. How they present themselves. But pure thinking is trained to penetrate these vials and come into direct contact with the true intention. My confidence was returning, and I was able to maintain a strong contact with Tane. Ordinarily it would be considered extremely disrespectful to look at an elder like this, but behind his genial demeanor was a serious challenge. It was like the game we had played when he'd tested the keenness of my observation on the street. How is pure thinking able to penetrate the appearance? Tane's smile was now gone. I hesitated. How, Elim? The questions became sharper. Initially by watching the direction of the eye movement when the interrogee answers, the frequency or absence of blinking, the intonation of the voice, the inflection. Was it flat? Overstated? Were the answers glib? Prepared? The breathing? Yes. Tane pushed me beyond the basics. What else? If the person can't hold his space. Space. Explain. If the energy field around him loses its shape and dissipates, then he has no defense against my probe and I can penetrate to his essential core. As I held Tane's look, I realized that I was locked into his energy field. We were two pit warriors engaged in a stratagem. Who am I, Elim? I didn't hesitate. Someone I must never let out of my awareness. This was the first time I was not terrified by his steady and unblinking eyes, which revealed nothing but my own reflection. After a moment he nodded and broke eye contact. And what do you think has been your most serious lapse of discipline, 10 Lubeck? The prefect asked in his disinterested tone. Or was it rather an uninflected way of asking questions that would reveal nothing? I began to answer that there were certain classes where I had given in to the boredom and did nothing to motivate my interest. And what about your Regner, Elim? Book content text. The breath flew out of me. I looked at Tane with naked amazement. Milet. Is that his name? In an instant, my carefully constructed mask for this meeting was ripped away, and I experienced the fear I had never felt before. I realized then that Tane knew more about me than I had ever imagined. The prefect now looked at me for the first time. I see, Tane continued when I couldn't. You think that you're the only one who can't disappear. A big mistake, Elim. He watched as I started to breathe again. Is there the lesson here, do you think? He asked gently. If you've mastered a tool or technique. I began, but I needed more air, and my tongue was thick and dry. They both waited patiently while I swallowed and breathed. Then there are others who have done the same before you, I managed to get out. Calyx first taught me this lesson. That's right, Elim, he said as if he were addressing the child. Whatever your mind conceives or imagines already exists in the world. It doesn't make the thought or conception any less valuable, it just means that this technique you've discovered must be used carefully. and with the understanding that if you use it against other people, it can also be used against you. With a clarity I'd never had, I heard what he was really saying to me. Sharaban had deceived me by masking his true intentions, hiding them behind the friendship he'd never meant to extend beyond the competition. I had taken it for granted that because he befriended me he had no hidden intentions. I felt a rush of shame. What a fool he had made of me. And then a disturbing thought attacked me. Was Valentine doing the same? I knew what Sharaban had wanted from me, but what did she want? Then you know about one Sharaban and one Carrie Eve. I looked at them both. So you have learned this lesson. I'm impressed, Elim. Tane turned to the prefect. I think this will suffice. The prefect nodded and turned the chip off. You will be leaving Bamaran, the prefect said to me. I just stared at him. It was clear that this was the end of the review and I had expected to receive my new designation. Leaving? Today. The shuttle will meet you in front of the central gate before the assembly, the prefect explained. But this is... It was a stunning blow, but I refused to submit. This is unfair, prefect. Yes, I admit. I broke rules. But I have done good work. In the pit? Asked Calyx. In the wilderness. Sharaban's victory was. He probably would have won, but nowhere near as impressively as he did with your contribution. We know all this, Elim, even with his negative recommendation, Tane added with his half-smile. I wasn't surprised by this last piece of information, but it sharpened the bitter taste in my mouth. You re being assigned to another school, the prefect informed me. What kind of school? I asked as my heart sank into the floor. You'll discover that when you get there, the prefect answered. Today you will return home. You will tell your parents only that you are awaiting reassignment. In the meantime, you will work with your father until the orders come. I advise you to make your preparations. I automatically stood up, but I couldn't leave. There was so much that was unsaid, unresolved. What is it, Garak? The prefect asked, using my name. Just like that. I was no longer a student. If I had stayed. I began. But you didn't, Elim, Tane interrupted. Pure thinking doesn't include what might have been if. I snapped to, inclined my head and started for the door. My lip, Tane's voice stopped me. A woman's name for a male Gregner? I just stood there, looking at them both. Did the prefect know my connection to Tane? Did he know that my parents lived in his house, and that my mother was his servant? Book content text. No matter. He gave me a last smile, and I left the office. The waiting room was filled again with other nervous students who were studying me intently, trying to discern my fate. I drew myself up and made a choice to expand my presence. I looked them each in the eye. I am number one, no matter what might have been, and from now on I'm going to make my presence count. Book content text. 22. My shed has become somewhat more bearable, but the clutter and confinement of the interior space requires that I leave the door open. To keep myself busy when I'm not working with the medicine unit, doctor, I am engaged in a project I must tell you about. It baffles me. Perhaps you can't tell me if I'm losing my mind altogether. Tane's house, as I mentioned, is trouble. One day I began moving some of the debris and arranging it into a pile. Since there was too much debris for just one pile, I arranged another. And then another. Until after hours of work I had carefully assembled several piles of debris in varying shapes and forms. I continued to create these piles and arrange them for 2, maybe 3 weeks, not knowing what I was trying to accomplish. But the work was satisfying, doctor, it felt good. And each day, when it became too dark to work, I would survey my creations, and I never felt prouder of anything I had ever done in my life. I don't know where the shapes came from, and I certainly couldn't explain their significance, but somehow they held me in their power. After several weeks I asked Parmac what he thought this was all about. He'd stop by intermittently and check on my progress at various stages, but he always kept his own counsel. On this day, he moved through the piles, there were dozens by now, and studied them from all vantage points. A very careful man. Finally, after what seemed like an age, he stopped in front of the pile that was the largest and held the central, dominant position. He turned to me with the strangest expression on his face and looked me directly in the eyes for the first time. I think this is your own archaeological dig, Elim. You are unearthing the artifacts of a previous civilization, a civilization that will never return, and arranging them into a memorial for that civilization and its dead. This is your own personal Tarlac sector. You're clearing the way for us to move on. Thank you, Elim. This is an honor for me. Parmak then chanted a section of the Cardassian burial ritual. He mentioned the names of several friends and relatives, and as he chanted, the cumulative emotional power of his voice was almost unbearable. I, too, had a list of the dead that long, and whispered their names as he chanted. Parmak then took his right hand, ripped open a finger on a sharp piece of metal, and allowed the blood to drip on this central monument. Thank you, he repeated, and walked away, his finger still dripping blood. But what baffles me, Doctor, is that I attach no meaning to what I'm doing here. I'm just doing it because I need to. And to be truthful, I don't see this as a memorial at all. On the contrary, if I could, I'd single-handedly rebuild this city myself, piece by piece. I stood here watching Parmak's blood dry on this pile of rubble, engulfed by a feeling of loss and utter mystification as to what these piles mean. Just assure me that I'm not going mad, Doctor. Book content text. 23 entry : I knew where Palantine was in the training area, and I waited behind a barrier for her class to come to an end. She was speaking with a classmate when I made my presence known. Her mate was somewhat shocked that a male student would behave in such a brazen manner, but Palantine gestured that she would deal with me and sent the mate on her way. So what did you use me for? I asked. What do we ever use each other for? She replied without hesitation. Answering the question with a questionly is an old trick, Palantine. No trick. I needed a friend. And you don't need a friend now. I hated the tone that was creeping into my voice. It's complicated, Elim. I was afraid to ask why. What did you use me for? She asked. The question truly baffled me. I only wanted her love. Wasn't using her. I would gladly have given mine in return. I would give anything. And I still would. I am leaving Bamaran, I said. Today. Why? It was her turn to be baffled. They didn't say. I was just told that I was being sent to another school. As I said it, my heart began to sink again. Then you're not being sent home? She asked, genuinely not understanding. Only until I am reassigned. Reassigned? She thought for a moment. Elim, are you sure it's a school where you're going? That's what the first prefect told me. The first prefect? I began to sense her concern. What do you think it is? I asked. I don't know. I've heard of a student being asked to leave. It happens often, but never reassigned. Who else was at your hearing? Simultaneously, I realized that I should not be telling her any of this, and Sharaban appeared. He stood behind Palantine. She saw my change of focus and turned. She shook her head. Not now, Barkan, she told him. What better time? This is the opportunity, so we take it, he explained to her. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I strongly felt the need to be prepared for anything, especially when Sharaban spoke of taking an opportunity. Hello, Lubac. Is it still 10 or are you number 1? He inquired. My name is Elim, correct? I replied. Yes, I know that, he laughed. But is it you or is it 8 Lubac that I have to keep my eye on now? It was the appearance of warmth that made his charm so attractive. A part of me wanted to tell him everything, to challenge the duplicity of his negative evaluation, but the clarity I found in the lower prefect's office was still with me. Looking at him, I was reminded how Palantine had taught me to smile when I asked questions. You have to watch both of us, Barkan. Yes, 1 and 2. Of course. But who makes the final decisions? Whose thinking do I pit mine against? He challenged. He assumed that he had some kind of advantage and he pressed it. I saw 3 openings for attack. He saw my stance and prudently covered the openings. I think it's you, Elim. He countered with another stance. He's leaving Bamaran today, Palantine told him. She was also telling him something else. Sharaban maintained his stance and never took his eyes off me, but his expression changed. Why? If anything, he was even more surprised than Palantine. Even with his treachery, he hadn't believed that my dismissal from Bamaran was a possibility. This told me that he had Window opened. Ocean 0, 131, 1920.